Welcome, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to another humanitarian talk titled Delivering Better Together, Diaspora Actors and the Humanitarian Ecosystem. My name is Alexandra, and I am the coordinator of the DEMAC initiative, the Diaspora Emergency Action and Coordination, which is a global initiative aiming to enhance coordination among diaspora organizations involved in humanitarian systems and across diaspora organizations and institutional humanitarian actors. Our aim is to increase the engagement and visibility for diaspora organizations in the humanitarian system and to contribute to a deeper understanding of diaspora actors as humanitarian actors and to help transforming the humanitarian ecosystem to be more inclusive of so-called non-traditional actors, which was also already touched upon this morning in a different panel, Boosting the Localization Agenda. If you zoomed in there and listened in, you already heard a little bit about the link of diaspora and the localization agenda. And today in the evening, we want to talk a little bit more about the diaspora engagement and how the links with the humanitarian ecosystem can be. Research has shown, and engagement with diaspora actors has shown, that diaspora organizations are multi-sectoral, fast-responding actors working transnationally, supporting countries of origin or heritage. They have a connection and understanding of the local contexts and play a vital role in humanitarian assistance, so are often part of the first response in the aftermath of a disaster or emergency. To enable a more inclusive and fair response and to support diasporas to be part of the broader humanitarian coordination system will help increasing the relevance, effectiveness, efficiency of the humanitarian responses and make them more sustainable. And during the conversation in the next hour, we want to present you some key findings on diaspora humanitarianism and hear from different diaspora representatives. Who are they? What are key added values of diaspora actors and their humanitarian responses? And how can coordination across different actors work? We would love to have a very interactive session with you all. So please do submit your questions in Slido. The link is just below. And having said all of this, I would like to introduce you to our speakers this evening. We have Lois Austin, who's a researcher who has worked for over 20 years in the humanitarian sector, undertaken a broad range of field-based and headquarters positions, mainly for the ICRC, and she has a deep understanding of humanitarian issues from policy and operational perspectives. As an independent consultant, Lois has managed and provided technical inputs into a varied range of humanitarian assistance and protection programs in various complex environments across the world. Lately, Lois has recently undertaken some research for DEMAC in looking at the role of diaspora in humanitarian response in East Timor, Pakistan, Somalia, Tunisia, and Ukraine. Thanks for joining us, Lois. Our next speaker is Fatumo Farah, who is the director of HIRDA Netherlands. Fatumo has been working at HIRDA, one of the pioneer diaspora organizations in Europe, for more than 15 years in different positions, from volunteering up to director of the organization. She has led, established, and fundraised for diverse successful projects in the organization intervention areas. Fatumo has been lobbying and advocating for diaspora contributions to the development of the home and better integration of migrants and refugees. She was one of the initiators of the establishment of the Diaspora for Development platform in the Netherlands in 2007 and the Global Somali Diaspora in 2014. She has contributed for many years to the GFMD Civil Society Days and the formation of the Global Compact at the UN in 2017. Thanks for joining us today, Fatumo. Our last speaker is Fadi Aldeire, the Regional Director of Hand in Hand for Aid and Development, HIFAD. Fadi has, in response to the commencement of the Syrian conflict in 2011, co-founded Hand in Hand for Aid and Development, leaving a career in finance in the UK and joining the organization's task force, leading and establishing the organization. Originally a two-man show, HIFAD has now grown into a highly successful and impactful organization with over 1,100 employees in offices in the UK, Turkey, Syria, and most recently Yemen. HIFAD is also a founding member of the Syrian NGO Alliance, which is an umbrella for diaspora and local NGOs, whose member delivers around 70% of aid to Syria. Fadi is a steering committee member in both SNA and the NGO Forum in Northwest Syria. Welcome, Fadi, and thank you all for joining this evening. So, for setting off and setting a bit the scene, Diaspora. Who is that actually, and who are diaspora humanitarians? So, Lois, you have been looking across different countries and contexts, crisis contexts. When doing the research lately, do you see similarities among the diaspora humanitarians in the different countries and contexts?
Thanks, Alexandra. Well, yes, for the 5 countries that we studied through the DMAC research, we did observe some similarities across the 5 countries. But at the same time, the diaspora response in each country and from each country was characterized with some unique differences. So in Pakistan, for example, there were no diaspora organizations which would be considered as purely humanitarian, as their work also tended to focus on longer term, what would traditionally be called development work. Broadly, though, we were able to categorize diaspora organizations into 4 different groupings based primarily on their structure. So category 1 covered diaspora organizations which are staffed, which also have volunteers and a governance structure, and tended to be officially registered in their countries of residence. The second category was slightly less formal than category 1, mainly with a volunteer base, no paid staff, and not systematically registered in their country of residence. Category 3 were based in the country of origin, but with some form of office or representative in the country of residence. And the 4th category would probably be better defined as a diaspora group rather than a diaspora organization. And they were characterized by loose networks of volunteers who came together to respond when a crisis hits their country of residence.
Thank you. And just a quick follow-up to that question, maybe. Do you see those groups equally represented in all contexts, or do you see some differences there already?
Well, there are definitely some differences. The 4th category, what we call diaspora groups, was very prevalent in Timor-Leste in their response, their humanitarian response there. Previously, there are a few structured groups, but they would normally fit into that category. And actually things changed over time as well. So for some countries, the longer the diaspora action, the more formal the groups have become. And that was seen more with Somalia and Pakistan, for example, where there's been very long-term, decades-long-term humanitarian interventions.
Thanks. And maybe from theory to practice, let's hear from our 2 diaspora representatives, Fatumo and Fadi. Both Syria and Somalia have been rather, let's say, protracted crises and have been, by now at least Syria as well, after 11 years, have been seen maybe a different involvement. Can you tell us a little bit about your organization and the setup? Do you see yourselves represented in, let's say, the categories Lois just said? Do you see your organization and your diaspora response fitting in that? Fadi, over to you.
Thank you so much. Yes, Lois summed it really well. Yes, we fit into the category of responding from the country of residence to the needs in the country of origin. When we started, we felt something must be done. I mean, when the revolution or crisis, as you want to call it, in Syria started, there was a need for us to interfere. At the time, it was emergency response. And then as it moved on, there was a need to balance between emergency response and ongoing or sustainable response as well. So this is where the diaspora would fit in the Syria context.
Thank you very much. Fatumo, do you see your organization, maybe you can give us a little bit of background of your organization as well. Do you see it fitting into the categories?
Thank you, Alexandra, and also the organizers of this event, EU. And actually, the category that Luis described is the process that all the diaspora actually go through. We started from the informal group, small organization up to big organization. So it is actually the objective of the group is if they wanted to be at the end structured organization, they can be. So as HIRDA, we started a group in 1996. 1998, we registered the organization in The Hague. And then in the years, we developed the organization from small group organization up to big organization who have a big projects in Somalia. The reason that why we started was actually in 1991, there was a civil war in Somalia and all the social services fell down. So as a diaspora group, we felt responsibility to do something. And that's what actually the drive to start HIRDA. We started as a humanitarian organization, but also development organization. And we also, at the same time, started a local organization who can also continue our projects. And, we need a local organization who can be represent the organization and can implement the projects. So actually the category that Luis described is actually the process that we've been go through in the years. And I understand, I feel it because I was also at the beginning of the organization. I understand. Thank you.
Thanks. And I already see there's many faces to diaspora organizations, which I imagine has a lot of positive things, but also can put some challenges, I think, and we'll come back to that in a second as well, when trying to engage and coordinate indeed the many faces and the many sides diaspora organizations can have. I'd be curious first to hear a little bit more about the beginnings of your engagement, Fadi and Fatumo, the motivation for you as diaspora members to engage in humanitarian action back in your countries of origin. What was your motivation? You've already lived in a new country of residence. You've already established a second home in a way. So what was your motivation to respond to a humanitarian crisis in your countries of heritage? Maybe Fatumo, you want to go first? And then Fadi.
Yeah, okay. My motivation actually was, I came here to the Netherlands in 1991 as a refugee, and I understand actually very good what is why is it important to support the people in need. And when you are a refugee, you are appreciating people who are helping you. And as a Somali diaspora, we felt that we are good position because we are in the Netherlands and we can support the people back home. Actually, that was one of my drives. But the second was actually girls' education. Girls' education is something that I always believe that it will help the women empowerment. So I said I should have to do something back home, but not only for me, but the group. They were actually, they have seen that they have a good position in the country that they are, and they can do something back home. So that was actually the reason why we started. And for me, girls' education was one of the things that I came join the organization. So that's actually the drive why I started the humanitarian. And in Somalia, there is a lot of humanitarian crisis. And one time you have a flood, drought, and civil war. You have a lot of things going on in Somalia, and the Somali diaspora, who are a huge group, they do the things, and they feel the responsibility to do something back home, and that is actually the drive here. Thank you.
Thanks. Fadi?
Well, our story is slightly different. I mean, the founder and myself as a co-founder, we both born in the UK. And we kind of moved to Syria for a few years, but the majority of our life, we lived in the UK. And the founder is a successful businessman after all. And I was doing really well in finance and accounting at the time, working for one of the major European energy companies. Now, for us, we were moved by photos or images coming from Syria at the early days of the crisis or revolution. We see the suffering, we see the people need treatment, need support. And this is where we thought something needs to be done. After all, Syria was one of these countries where we have a high level of education. I mean, a high rate of literacy rate. People were self-dependent, self-sustained. And then all of a sudden to see people needing help, we felt there must be something to be done. Both myself and the founder, at some stage we thought, yes, we want to go back to Syria and live there. It was really prosperous at the time, until the revolution or the crisis started. We were seeing images of people needing medical help and they cannot be treated in hospitals. So this is where the idea of field hospitals or makeshift hospitals came into action. And at some point we set up 75 field hospitals within, I think in 2012, before slowly moving into proper hospitals in areas outside the control of the government. So this was the motivation for us.
Thank you very much for sharing. Thanks. I think that's really it's always good to hear the background and the motivations of diaspora organizations and really see the connections that even Fadi, even if not growing up there, you have still a strong tie and having lived there for certain years, obviously. Yeah. Thanks. I have a question for the three of you. Looking at diaspora humanitarians as diaspora organizations, what would you see as key advantages and key strengths of diaspora humanitarians? Maybe Fatumo, if you want to say a few words, and then Lois and Fadi, over to you.
I think the key advantage of the diaspora are the position that they have and the accessibility of the country, the quick mobilization of funding, the networks, the understanding of the local context. I think that those are the advantage of the diaspora. And what we have seen is actually when we started our project is in the Netherlands. In the beginning, we didn't have a funding. The funding was coming from from the diaspora themselves. And what we have done was actually map all the diaspora and explain why we are doing and what we are doing in the country. And in a year, we could actually mobilize a funding that we can start and build the schools actually. So and that feeling that the diaspora have of the responsibility, they also are willing to do something. So I think the advantage that we have is that accessibility, the knowledge of the local concept, quick mobilization, and quick understanding of the context actually. And the outreach of the diaspora is something that we can do. And there is a lot of WhatsApp groups or Facebooks or something like this, and you can reach actually in very quick time a lot of diaspora who are willing to do something. So I think that's the position that they have, and it should have to be coordinated and managed well. But there is a big, huge, and opportunity within the diaspora when it comes to humanitarian response. Thank you.
Thanks, Lois.
Yeah, and maybe just to add on the previous point about motivation, from the research that we did across 5 countries, and one of them was Somalia, so Fatumo has covered that. Certainly, social connectedness was a really important motivating factor, and kind of maintaining links and social cohesion with countries of origin. But across the board, alleviating human suffering was a key motivation. I mean, not much to add around the advantages, because this is what we found across, again, all the 5 countries, that really the ability of diaspora organizations to rapidly and proactively raise funds and then use their existing networks and contacts to distribute aid, whether that was cash or in kind, on their behalf, were really key advantages. And then also, for a number, not all, but a vast majority of diaspora organizations, that local knowledge and cultural understanding that Fatumo mentioned, which is considered to be very positive in terms of ensuring that the right people are assisted. So I think, there's a real agreement there on what some of those critical advantages are, but I don't know, maybe Fadi has something else to add.
Thank you. It's always a challenge talking after 2 experienced colleagues here. Well, I'll try not to repeat what my colleagues has mentioned, but it's worth mentioning the quick mobilization of funds, like earlier mentioned. Uh, we at the early days we were looking and appealing for INGOs to support, and of course, I mean, with it being the early days of the conflict in Syria, nobody wants to be involved, nobody wants to move on. So that's where we came in as Diaspora, and this is where we started mobilizing funds quickly. Uh, we also took on advocacy as well. The early days of Syria, nobody was talking about what was really happening. Nobody would dare. So this is where we came into place, and we started talking about the suffering of civilians and how people were. I'm not going to go into politics, but it was a really difficult times in the early days. Now, we also kind of like were held accountable. I mean, when somebody wants to give money in the EU or in the UK or anywhere else, they want to know who they're giving the money to. And this is where in 2011 we were operating as volunteers, but in 2012 there was a need for us to establish a charity or a foundation in the UK because people wanted to know where the money is going on. And this is where we were held accountable in the UK. So accountability was key. Plus, again, we had an understanding of the local context or the context in Syria. So it worked both ways. So we know how the British culture would think, and then we also know how the Syrian culture would think. So we were going kind of like building the bridges between both communities. Thank you.
Thanks. And that's really, I heard it from all of you several times. Indeed, it's like the local context and contextual understanding. And I think this is also really linking back to the panel this morning on boosting the localization and seeing where can bridge building happening. And indeed, Fadi, as you just said, you know the cultures, you can build this bridge because you've been in both and you have been experienced with both, and diasporas might have a key advantage there. So thanks for indeed raising that point. Slightly different question, Fatou Fadi. What are the core challenges diaspora organizations face? You already hinted at some things, but maybe just really concretely, is there something core challenge as a diaspora organization when responding to a humanitarian crisis, both in the long and in the short term? What is the core challenges you face, and how did you deal with them? Sorry, Fadi, over to you maybe first.
Okay, yeah, good. Okay. Well, one of the challenges would be we often get told, well, you're not local, you're not from Syria, yeah? But we are Syrians after all. Do you really understand our needs? And then we say, yes, we have a team. And I used to go to Syria. I spend the weekend, every weekend when I'm in Turkey, I would spend the weekend in Syria and meet beneficiaries, meet local people. Until recently, that's when I stopped going. But I still have a direct and open Facebook page. So I speak to the communities inside Syria. They raise their concerns. And then I send them messages. So this would be one of the challenge is, do you really represent us? And we try and say, yes, we do represent you. Now, another challenge is where we see there is big need and we can't meet every single need. I think one of the stressing comments we keep hearing, oh, look, it's winter again, it's snowing, and none of the NGOs are responding. And then this is where we try and say, look, we as NGOs, we can only meet 10% of the need, and hand in hand alone cannot cover all the needs, for example. So of course there are going to be some gaps. So again, another challenge would be to try and change the donor perspective. So the donors would say, oh, this is the donor priority. But we see different priorities. So we try and, I'm not going to say influence, but we try and make the donors change or at least adopt different strategy. So quite a few challenges. I can go on forever, but I will leave some time.
Do share if you have also some solutions to those challenges. How have you dealt with the donors, for example? How have you, if they come and say no, that's not our priority, what have you done?
Well, what we've done is we kind of like raised funds privately. So the donors will say, no, this is not going to work. So we raise funds privately, and then we implement the project, and then we present the outcomes or the results to the donors. And we feel like this is the best way to convince the donor, yes, it is needed. Now, with the global crisis in terms of funding, there is less money coming in, less money for humanitarian, and this is another challenge. So we keep saying, look, let's spend less money on humanitarian or emergency assistance and do more on the development. So the challenge would be, well, Syria is a protracted crisis, and we should carry on doing emergency response. So it's just like trying to reach a balance between emergency and development work. I'm not saying development as in rebuilding or reconstruction, but if we do rehabilitation to the water network, this would mean less need for water trucking. So it's just like trying to balance.
Thanks a lot. Fatumo, any challenges on your side you faced as a diaspora organizations, and any solutions?
Yeah, I do agree also, Fadi. All the challenge that he has said is actually, we have all those challenges. The other things that I'm going to add is the high expectation from local actors, even the local government, even the government themselves. Everybody is actually approaching us to do something when something happens, and we cannot cover all that needs. So it is actually a big expectation as a diaspora organization. So it is very difficult to manage that expectation, which we cannot actually cover. It's one of the things. The second is capacity of the local actors and even within the diaspora. When it comes about core humanitarian standards, it is not actually something that's very known within the diaspora. They do things without knowing that core humanitarian standards. So I think that's one of the challenges that we need actually to update and to train within the diaspora. The third thing is, as a diaspora, there is a lot of diaspora groups in different categories. There is a long-term vision is missing. You know, something happened and people are acting and they do actions, but then it stops. There is no follow-up. Something else is not done. That is it. The groups are stopping and then they start when something other happens. That is actually like, you know, missing a long-term strategy of the actions of the diaspora groups. We have also, and we have seen also sustainability of the actions. And it is also related with the long-term strategy. We've seen people are building schools or building an MCH or something else, and then not thinking about what comes after. You know, there is a running course, there is a lot of other things coming. So sometimes I see that there is action which is good actually, but sometimes not having a follow-up action. So sustainability is also one of the other things that we have seen within the diaspora groups. So as an organization, what we have done to actually guarantee our organization sustainability, we started establish an organization, local organization, who is actually responsible for the programs in Somalia. And the organization is HIRDA actually, and they have a partnership with the government and also and UNICEF and INGOs and UN organizations, and we can guarantee our long-term strategy from there. What we do is now capacity building for our site, funding, and lobby and advocacy, something like this. So I think it is very important to think about how can we sustain our programs in our home countries, and also learn from the other organizations who are also doing humanitarian response. So that is actually the main challenges that we have seen in the time that we have been working in humanitarian response of humanitarian crisis. Thank you.
Thanks. And before I ask Luis on the challenges, I have a follow-up question for you, Fatumo. I was wondering, capacity development of local organizations, you said that can be sometimes a challenge, and you work a lot with local organizations in Somalia. Mm-hmm. So how do you approach that? How do you from HIRDA manage that?
Well, we do actually, and I know we have been giving our organization, local partners, training, sometimes online training, sometimes Diaspora goes there and they do training, project management, monitoring, evaluation, but also financial management. So one of the other things that Diaspora can contribute is like skills transfer, which is very, very important for the local actors. And that is actually what we have done and see that it is it has a very good impact within the local, local organizations. So not only that we are helping, just giving hand or giving food distribution or something like this, of implementing project, but also we are transferring our skills. If someone from Hirta, for example, or some other diaspora from UK go to Somalia, we ask them to train, our local partners or some of our staffs of some of the staffs of our partners. So actually, that is the way that we cover that capacity building. But capacity building itself, we always take in our funding, a small part of the funding, capacity and professionalization of our organization. That's also something that we have done in the time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that. I'll give the word to Lois, and then I see Fadi wants to add something on the challenges. But Lois, maybe first from your research also, is there anything that stuck out on the challenges and the solutions to challenges as well?
Yeah, I mean, other challenges that we came across were for some of the newer diaspora organizations or organizations who were newer to humanitarian interventions, and trying to implement a rapid response. Finding trustworthy and reliable partners wasn't always easy because they simply didn't have that experience. Also, from a kind of distribution and administrative perspective, local authorities were not always keen to authorize diaspora action because they were not considered as established charities, and that could also have problems in terms of distributing in-kind goods, and also money transfer from abroad, complying with the different international money transfer regulations. Some diaspora organizations found that to be a challenge as well. I can see Fadi's smiling. I don't know if it's that challenge or something else. I'll hand over to you, Fadi.
No, thank you. I totally agree with you. I know Fatuma mentioned the capacity capacity issues. This was a question always raised. You don't have the capacity, and until now, even after 11 years or 10 years of having audited account, we still don't have access to direct donor funds, and they blame it on capacity. When we raise funds, it's unfortunately people don't start contributing or donating. Whenever we have like a winter appeal, we don't get any money immediately. People need to see the crisis happening before they donate. And by the time it happens and we respond, it's far too late. Even as diaspora, it takes I think a minimum of a week before we are able to respond. And a week is too long sometimes. So never mind about institutional donors. A final bit was where we challenged the donors was on dignified shelter. We always called, it's like, let's move people from tents into dignified shelter by building a purpose-built accommodation. And they all said, no, you can't do it, you can't do it. But when the Syrian NGOs and the diaspora started building shelters, donors now, after 8 years of us appealing, they said, yeah, I think it's a good idea and it can be done. So by being persistent, we are able to do it. Thank you.
Thanks. And going maybe from the challenges and the solutions to a bit more coordination on different levels. As mentioned initially, DIMAC focuses a lot on building the bridges and enhancing coordination of different actors. So there's a lot of different levels of coordination we look at that can be in countries of origin, it can be in countries of residence, it can be coordination among diaspora organizations with each other, and as well coordination between diaspora organizations and institutional humanitarian actors such as INGOs, local NGOs, the UN's institutions, etc. Each of these many coordination aspects comes with different layers and questions, and I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into some of those. Having also seen how diverse diaspora actors can be, and that indeed we have, let's say, loser groups, probably kitchen table conversations that are almost diaspora organizations or diaspora groups, as Lois, as you categorized them in the beginning, to long-established organizations with governance structures. when looking at coordination, can you share a little bit from the research and the experience? How does it go? What are challenges? What are existing opportunities? How did it go? Maybe we'll start with Fatumo. Maybe you can speak a bit more about diaspora coordination before I'll hand the word to Fadi and then Lois.
Thank you, Alexandra. Coordination is actually one of the challenges within the diaspora because the new techniques of social media, of fundraising, make the diaspora even fundraising fragmented. The groups are starting actually fundraising for a region or city or somewhere else, but there is no coordination, I should have to say. And that is the reason is that some of the most diaspora fundraisers are actually groups, and when they are doing actually that group is they are not linked, and the way the diaspora works, it's not like the way that INGOs or NGOs work. It's not like needs assessment to where is that needs assessment, how can we fund that programs. It's more sensation, like something happened and people react. So at the last times we have seen that there is a lot of groups raising funding, and sometimes the funding goes one place. So within the diaspora, there is no coordination. Actually, there is no coordination, and we've been trying to do some coordination within the diaspora. And we are starting actually a Somali diaspora network, and within diaspora organization is in Europe that can actually share and the activity that they are doing and their actions. So it is something very new. We are now trying to become together and see how can we coordinate and see who is doing what and where. So that coordination actually is not there. It is more fragmented. The diaspora groups, even the organization is, and the reason is that they are not working like INGOs, or they are not using all those tools that INGOs use. So I think there is a lot of work within the diaspora when it comes to coordination. And that is actually what we do actually is like our organization is actually linked with the clusters. So we have in our local organization a cluster meeting, and they know what is going on there, and we get from them the needs that UNHCR and produce. So for us, it's a little bit easier to get those things because we have been actually doing the humanitarian response for so long. So we are not saying that other organizations, but what we have seen is like there is no coordination within the diaspora groups when it comes to humanitarian response. And I think it is something that we need to focus how we can make that coordination well, and also include within the UN clusters. And funding accessibility is also one of the challenges, and I forget to tell last time because diaspora organization, even the professional diaspora organization, have a difficult to get funding. So I think that's one of the challenges also, and I said we need to add also the challenges. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and I take that the coordination you just mentioned within the cluster system and the humanitarian response in the country works in your case quite well, but diaspora coordination is still in like early stages in a way, but you are trying. Fadi, how does it look on your end, and also how do you as a diaspora organization perceive coordination?
Well, I think Fatuma started with a grim picture. I think the situation in Syria is not, sorry, with the Syrian diaspora. Let me talk about the UK and Europe. It's not any better. There is a huge competition amongst the diaspora. For example, when we used to have besieged areas and areas hard to reach, all the diaspora wants to raise funds because I think it was more like of a show off. I'm sorry to say, but it was like a show off. And yes, we can reach these besieged areas, but we were doing harm by doing good at the time. We were trying to reach to the besieged areas, and we were procuring locally. There was no coordination at all amongst the diaspora. Now, however, the good news, we, the diaspora NGOs, when we operate cross-border from Turkey, there is an amazing coordination. And the coordination is, whether it's on the operational level or the advocacy level, or even at head of mission level. We meet here it's quite often we have the diaspora responding to one big convoy, for example. Some would respond to shelter, some would respond to health, some would respond to, for example, food security. So this is where the diaspora come to work together, but away from the country of residence. So it is working sometimes, but it is failing.
Thanks. Just a follow-up question. How did you set up that amazing coordination, or what was because you said in the response across the border, there is an amazing coordination, if I quote you correctly here. How did that come into play? Like, what would be the advice you would give any diaspora across the world to start with that?
Well, let me start with the bad one. I mean, we started a coordination, but that was influenced on us by in the UK. Because it was influenced on us, we said, no, we're not going to follow it up, because it was more like by the British government. So we said, no, we're not going to do it. But when we went to the field level, this is when there was a need for NGOs to coordinate. There was no UN clusters at the time. And this is when we started sitting together. And I have to give you credit to the FCDO, the UK Foreign Office at the time, for saying you need to come and sit down casually. So we started sharing information. A few years on, it saw the birth of the NGO Forum for Northwest Syria. This is where we used to sit and discuss the operations, on area level, at area level. After a while, after a few years on, after the United Nations resolution allowing for a cross-border, we managed to establish something called SNA, Syrian NGO Alliance, and the SNA is purely focused on advocacy. So we kind of like sit and coordinate for advocacy, and informally we coordinate operations, but the operations tend to coordinate now under the UN umbrella or cluster.
Thanks a lot. And now, Lois, I'd be very happy to hear from you on the research. When you looked at coordination, and I know that was a core element, obviously, what did you find? Any key highlights? And I'll already, because just being aware of time, I'd like to give you a second question at hand as well. Ukraine, you've done some research on Ukraine, and looking at that, is that somewhere where there is coordination in place? Is that something where you can see the research conducted? Did have any diasporas now also responding? So just already picking up on the questions that are in Slido as well. So combining both. Go ahead.
I mean, just a very quick one on the coordination between diaspora organizations, and we found pretty much what's already been said, that there really hasn't been much in the countries of origin, with the exception of Tunisia, where we had an example in Switzerland, for example, of 11 diaspora organizations coming together and doing a joint fundraising campaign for COVID-19. But generally, the levels of coordination between diaspora organizations and the institutional humanitarian actors, so cluster systems and the like, was varied. So in Ukraine, before what we're seeing today, so before the beginning of this year, Timor-Leste and Tunisia, there was limited coordination on the ground. And in fact, in Tunisia, there was no institutional humanitarian coordination structure in place. So that's not surprising. The strongest levels of coordination we saw in terms of direct coordination were through participation in joint needs assessments and in cluster meetings, but this was really rare. And we saw it in Pakistan a little bit and Somalia a little bit, but mostly through it was the partners of diaspora organizations who were participating in this way. And in terms of coordination and implementation, we sometimes saw diaspora organizations relying more on their local partners, as I say, to participate in the more formal coordination mechanisms. What we did see was that diaspora organizations coordinate with local authorities, and community representatives and receiving institutions, so medical bodies, for example, if it was medical equipment. You mentioned Ukraine, and since the research was concluded towards the end of last year, there's actually been a slight change in Ukraine. And so at the end of 2021, after the research, DMAC hosted a number of workshops, and the health and the food security and livelihoods clusters from Ukraine specifically requested meetings with diaspora organizations in order to establish a communication and facilitate information sharing. And that has been an extremely useful move today, and this wasn't foreseen, of course, but particularly in the last month, where we see now that DMAC has a representative attending cluster meetings in Ukraine, representing Ukrainian diaspora organizations, and cluster representatives have in the last couple of weeks attended what are now ongoing weekly meetings held between Ukrainian diaspora organizations. So that's a very big shift from the years that we covered in our research, which was sort of late 2013, 2014 to end of 2021, when in Ukraine there was, I would say, pretty much zero coordination, to attendance now at cluster meetings with a representative for diaspora organizations.
Thanks, Lois. And that must be, I mean, I know you've been leading on the Ukraine research, so it's also probably very nice to see a direct impact in such a way, actually, of the research and really action out of it on that. Staying maybe, Lois, directly with you, you've highlighted the positive example of Ukraine now, that despite very unfortunate circumstances is becoming a positive example of coordination. I'm sure not everything is always that successful, and there's also a lot of critical points raised when looking at coordinations. Can you talk a little bit about that maybe as well?
I mean, I think one of the challenges or the issues that we found, again, across all the countries that we looked at, was the discussion with institutional humanitarian actors highlighted that they actually have very limited knowledge of the humanitarian work of diaspora organizations. They did state an interest in forming stronger linkages, and it's fantastic that we see that now in Ukraine, but really there wasn't a knowledge or an understanding or an awareness of the work being done by diaspora actors.
So I hope everyone in the room listening in today is taking well note of that and learning about indeed diaspora organizations as humanitarian actors and responders. Before opening up for questions from the audience, I would like to give each one of you also the opportunity maybe to quickly say any recommendations or suggestions on how to improve coordinations, if knowing that there's key actors, there's donors in the room listening in, there is INGOs and UN representatives, there's cluster representatives listening in right now. What would be the one thing they could do tomorrow morning to enhance coordination and to start working with diaspora organization? What action point could you give them? Fadi, do you want to start?
Yeah, okay, I'll start. I mean, if I can go back in time 11 years ago, I think we just need to mature up, yeah? And we need to sit down and talk to each other. We need to sit down and realize, yes, diaspora, we can make a difference together. I know we talked at some point about merging some NGOs, some diaspora NGOs, and then we thought, no, that's not a good idea, because if we merge 3 NGOs into one and then ended up shutting up, we're shutting 3 organizations. But if we have 3 organizations working alongside each other and complement each other's work, then we can make a huge difference. We need to make sure when we do fundraising, we can do one event and then split the funds between us. So that's for the diaspora. Now, for me, it's like I always have the question: what are we? I mean, as Hand in Hand for Aid and Development, are we diaspora organization? Yes, we started from the UK. But now we moved the operations into neighboring countries. So we're leading the operations directly. So we're not relying on local expertise. Sorry, we're relying on the local staff, but we're not relying on local aid agencies. So we're just implementing directly. So what are we? So this is the question where we're not sure what to ask.
Thank you. Fatumo, what would be your recommendation and suggestion to different actors?
Okay, actually what I will say is like, to improve the coordination, we need to strengthen the diaspora networks. And there is a diaspora networks within the 4 organizations, and I think that is need to strengthen them because they can work together. When they are organized themselves, they can coordinate better. So what I say is like, please strengthen the coordination and networks of the diaspora. Other thing is include the diaspora actors within the humanitarian policy, because that is not the case actually. And before, for example, matching and funding matching is something that diaspora can use when they raise the funding. If the matching program is, they can actually reach more than what they are doing. So funding accessibility is one of the things that we say we don't have that actually. And so I think, I'm not saying that all the diaspora should have to get, but if the diaspora improve their organizational structure and governance, they should have to be also taken as a serious actor of the humanitarian response. So that is also the other thing that I'm saying. I think it is a very, very interesting to make very real we have done a lot of research, and we know and acknowledge the contribution of diaspora when it comes to humanitarian response, but it is only paper. So we need to make an actions and encourage and improve the partnership within INGOs and the diaspora, INGOs and UN, and within the diaspora themselves. The third thing that I'm going to say is build the capacity of the diaspora themselves, but also local partners. And that is my last actually recommendation that I'm giving to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Lois, what would be your recommendation to the different actors? What would be your action point tomorrow morning?
I mean, I would say follow the lead of Ukraine, and cluster leads do reach out to DMAC to help form those linkages. I think DMAC, a recommendation would be to really continue to champion the work of diaspora organizations within country level institutional coordination mechanisms to make sure that their efforts are acknowledged. This could include providing guidance to the clusters, to humanitarian country teams, to find ways to include the diaspora voice and ensure their participation, not just attendance, but participation in those coordination mechanisms, much as we've seen a real push for that in recent years for local and national NGOs. And to the extent possible, include what diaspora organizations are doing in humanitarian response analyses and in the financial tracking service.
Thanks. Maybe that would be the point where I need to put a disclaimer that I didn't pay you for that answer at all, nor for having a dog in the background. But
sorry.
Thanks. No, thanks a lot. I mean, you've been doing a lot of research last year on that, so yes. I see some questions from Slido have come in, and I know we have only 5 minutes left, but I would like to pick at least one or two. And give them to you. So one is, and you've hinted at it several times, and I noted it down several times from all of you, talking about the humanitarian development peace nexus. Do diaspora organizations have a role to play in it? And if so, which one? What can be taken, and what role can diaspora organizations have in that? Fatumo, do you want to start, and then Lois and Fadi?
Yes, I can start actually. Diaspora and that question is very, very important, because we know Somalia, for example, is one of the countries that has been in conflict so many years. So diaspora can play a role for mediation and peace building and within the context of humanitarian response. So and that is what we have seen actually. There is a lot of diaspora going back to Somalia and starting conflict mediation and all those things. So sure, diaspora can play a big role within humanitarian peace nexus. So and it is very, very important. And sometimes we say diaspora are party, and I say are part of the conflict sometimes. So if they are part of the conflict, they can be part of solution. So they can play a big role. And I know one time in the Netherlands, it happened that the group is started here, peace building in a country of origin. They have been organizing conferences here, and the people in home are joining. And at the end, there was a solution within that region. So I think it is very, very important that diaspora not only play but humanitarian response and the development, but also peace. They can also do that. So give you back, Alexandra.
Alexandra, you muted.
Sorry, thanks for that. Lois, do you want to add anything on the nexus?
I mean, just very briefly to agree with Fatuma, and just to say that we saw that it was already happening, particularly in Somalia and Pakistan, these longer term interventions where there is humanitarian action, but it's often linked to a longer term approach. And it's just that diaspora organizations aren't using the terminology, the nexus, but they are doing it.
Thanks. Fadi, you've been nodding.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Lois. We are doing it already in Syria, but we're not using the term nexus. We try and push donor or encourage donor to have long-term solutions. So we are doing it in a sense, but under a different name.
Thank you very much. I have one last question, seeing that we have 3 minutes left. Looking at a topic that also I think was looked at in the research quite a bit, and that's also I think you are confronted with once in a while, Fadi and Fatumo, accountability to affected communities, and how do diaspora organizations deal with accountability? Anyone wants to go first? How do you deal with accountability to affected communities?
Let me take it. I guess I mean, as I said earlier, we kind of I think there was a question, do we see ourselves as local NGOs or do we see ourselves as diaspora? We're lost in between. We have proper accountability mechanism for the local community and for the donors as well. So we have a balance. So for organizations like Hand in Hand for Aid and Development, it's totally different from any other diaspora because we are properly established. But for the diaspora organizations, I mean, if I look back in time, it's I think we were kind of trying to do some accountability at the time before it was developed further. So the accountability developed over time. Yeah.
Thanks. Fatumo, how do you handle accountability?
Yeah, what we do actually is we are organization and accountable for the donors that funded our program. So we have, all those things and structures just to show what we have done. And when it comes to local and partners or local community, we also train them how they can be accountable for the organizations and the government. So, and it is one of the things that we do. If programs are started, we train the people, what is the program, so that they are involved with what's going on, what is the project objectives, activities, so that they can follow what's going on within the community. So that's one of the things that we engage the community so that they can understand what we are doing, because that is their project. They should have to know this is the things that we are doing, and that is the way that we put in ourselves accountable within the community. So and the other side, the funders, they get reports and everything they need, and the things necessary for our projects. So I think that is the way that we do. We are the Dutch organization registered here, and all the regulation that are here in place are also for us. So we should have to also report the donors and give what we have done. But the community that we work, we should have to explain what is the things that we are doing. And they should have to understand, because without understanding of what we are doing, they cannot put you accountable. They should have to understand what is the project, what are you doing, how are you doing, who is the beneficiary, and the end result, so that they can see and monitor with ourselves the program. So that is the way that we do.
Thanks. Lois, anything to add from a research perspective?
Yeah, I mean, and not to disagree with Fatuma at all, because I think it varies from country to country and from organization to organization, actually. But we found that in our research across the countries, the majority of diaspora organizations place more emphasis on accountability to donors reporting what they'd done, and that varied depending on who the donor was, and with a less focus on accountability to the communities and the people that they were assisting. But that wasn't across the board, but it was the majority emphasized more donor accountability to donors. Over.
Thanks a lot. And I think there's a lot more that we could explore, and I've taken quite some notes, and I see questions are still coming in. Unfortunately, our hour is over. We have to wrap up. I think also people might want to wrap up the day after many sessions and interesting conversations. I'd like to thank you all, Lois, Fatuma, Fadi, very much for joining me today on the panel and having a conversation around diaspora humanitarians and how to engage with the institutional ecosystem. Also, very much a big thank you to everyone who has been listening in the last hours and sending us some questions. I hope you learned something out of the conversation. I hope you got some inspirations or maybe even an action point for tomorrow morning, how to enhance coordination. And also a big thank you to the DEMAC team behind the scenes, and a very big thank you to the organizers, the European Commission and the French presidency, for allowing us to have this space this evening and to share a little bit about our work and our research. And having said all of that, I wish you all a very nice evening. Thanks and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.